So we're going to go across to Canada now. It's one of the beauties of being able to be online for conferencing, and hear from Teena Stoddart, who was a police officer for 30 years, supporting many critical thinking positions in the Canadian police. She's held positions in frontline policing, human resources, major case management, planning, performance and analytics, quality assurance, and as the violent link coordinator. She received training on serious sexual predators from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the FBI, as well as training at FBI conferences. It's a huge pleasure to be able to welcome her to the Nature Watch Foundation Conference for the Animals of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'll just share the screen here and we can get started. Just bear with me. Is everybody hearing me okay?
Yeah, we've got the, we can hear you okay.
Okay. Just trying to get the presentation up here. There we go. So again, thank you, Mark. And before I get started, I want to thank Mark and Nature Watch and all the people that brought this conference to us. I've put together national conferences before, and I know that they are a tremendous amount of work, but putting together a conference with multiple languages across various time zones, I can't even imagine doing that. So thank you for all your hard work. My presentation will be around 45 minutes. I'll be speaking fairly fast to get through all of the material. If there are any questions, please write them down as we go and send me an email. I promise to get back to you within 24 hours. My contact information is up on the screen now. I'll be referring to my website because all of the material that I refer to today is on my website. Before we get started, the subjects of violence and pedophilia and bestiality are not common to most people. Some people have a hard time with these subject matters, so if you are having a hard time with them and they're triggering a past experience of violence, please don't continue to watch. If you have a hard time after, please seek somebody from a healthcare professional. So what's the violence link? Violence link is the link between animal abuse and human abuse. It's important to note this is not animal abuse training. It has been established through decades of evidence-based research where there's an animal abused, there's a high probability of violent crime has or will be committed on a human, and vice versa, by the way. This research is supported by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, the FBI, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and crime studies by universities around the world. So violence link training objectives. Conferences provide a lot of great information, but true training for any frontline professional dealing with victims of violent crime should include elements of education, intervention, and prevention. Information does not do any good if the recipient does not know how to apply it in their field. I noticed that the conference agenda said I'd be talking about violence link in general. We don't have time to do that today, so I'll be focusing on partner abuse, a little on sexual abuse and how animal abuse plays a role in those crimes. You'll receive very basic information on partner violence with animals involved. Further training should be taken if you're going to be investigating a domestic violence where an animal is involved. My presentation on violence link is based on evidence-based research that applies to almost every violent crime any police service investigates. Evidence-based research is peer-reviewed research. It's not just somebody's own findings. So if I do research and I put out my findings and it is not reviewed or a critical eye looked at by my peers or other subject matter experts in the field, then it's my findings. Evidence-based research has peer-reviewed. And it started with the medical field, and policing now pretty well only uses evidence-based research. It comes with the medical field, when they have a trial that fails in way less than 10%, like most failure rates are around 3 or 4, we have evidence-based research on violence link where our percentages of animal abuse linked to human crime is well over 43%. Okay, so that tells you how highly linked animal abuse and human abuse is. Before we get into the research, I have a couple of slides with information that I want you to remember when you're interacting with people. Look for how humans interact. Does one person shut the other person down every time they try and talk? That can be a sign of dominance and trying to control someone. Look and note the demeanor of people when you ask the hard questions. Do they get aggressive or withdraw? This can indicate that there's something more going on than what's apparent to the eye. General conversations with children and elderly people will divulge crimes you would have never known about. And I'm not talking about an interrogation style conversation with children and elderly people. I'm talking, I'll give you an example. If a veterinarian has a child in their clinic with the owner of the animal, just a simple conversation with the child saying something like, Fluffy seems like a nice dog. Is Fluffy your dog or Daddy's dog? Sometimes, and it's happened to police officers, you'll hear children come out and say things like, oh, Daddy doesn't like Fluffy. He kicks her when she's bad. Okay, so those general conversations will reveal a lot of information that you wouldn't have known had you not had that conversation. So animal abuse is not normal behavior. Well, we all know that, but we tend to rationalize it when we're in the field dealing with violent crimes. So for an example, an officer goes to a domestic violence situation and we ask the victim, are you okay? The victim says, yes, he just threatened to throw the dog down the stairs. We're so relieved everyone's okay, we skip the significance of the threats to the animal. And we have a lot of other things on our plate, so we skip over that. Breaking an animal's leg, wounding them, poisoning them, kicking or beating them, or killing them besides hunting or farming is not normal. And reputable hunters and farmers, when they kill an animal, they do so as quickly as possible with the least amount of pain and suffering to the animal. Okay, animal behavior goes against our social norms, and in Canada and a lot of the U.S. states now, we're seeing courts give increased penalties for violence-linked cases. So when you have animal abuse, usually indicates there's something else going on psychologically with the abuser. Okay. Many convicted violent offenders are diagnosed with conduct disorder, which is made up of a lot of antisocial behaviors. And one of those antisocial behaviors to be diagnosed with conduct disorder is animal abuse. Okay. There's different reasons for violence on a living being as opposed to inanimate objects. It's not the same as punching or kicking a wall. Okay, if you punch or kick a wall, you get some frustration out, but there's no feedback from that wall or that chair, right? Somebody who abuses living beings, children like humans or animals, the abuser gets some kind of feedback. They can get a sense of control, sexual arousal. There's a whole host of feedback they get, some that lights up the pleasure centers of their brain. To stop the cycle of violence, there must be an intervention. And it could be incarceration, in-depth counseling. Some doctors use medications, but there has to be some sort of intervention there or the violence will continue. There's a lot of research and studies stating that women and children form strong bonds to their pets. Research indicates that over 90% of pet owners consider their companion animal to be a valued family member and report the emotional bond between the pet owner and their companion animal can be as intense as that experienced in human relationships. Facilitating similar psychological benefits. Some of those psychological benefits are they alleviate feelings of loneliness and isolation. We saw this during the pandemic. So we saw that people that never owned pets before went out and got a pet, right, to stop the isolation and loneliness. They also reduce perceptions of stressful events, and they foster positive mental health on a daily basis. So we're going to start with a definition, common definition of partner abuse. Intimate partner violence refers to the behavior by an intimate partner or ex-partner that causes physical, sexual, or psychological harm, including physical aggression, sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and controlling behavior. We heard Andrew Campbell yesterday speak about domestic violence. I want to clarify the difference between domestic violence and partner abuse. So partner abuse involves a partner or ex-partner, where domestic abuse can include abuse of any family member. Okay, so just so that we're clear on that. With respect to partner abuse, approximately every 6 days, a woman in Canada is killed by her intimate partner. In Europe, it is a woman every 4 days. And in the United States of America, it's close to 3 women a day. It's very prevalent, and that's why today we decided to focus the violence link portion of this presentation on partner assault. Partner abuse and partner violence knows no boundaries in terms of socioeconomical status, cultural background, sexual identity, or preference in gender relationships. It is not a crime that happens only in marginalized societies. Professionals working with victims need to recognize victim reluctance, vulnerabilities, barriers, challenges, and risk factors. Because of some of these vulnerabilities, barriers, challenges, and risk factors, it can take up to 12 times for a woman to leave and come back into an abusive situation before she leaves for good. Okay? And this is very, very important for all of us to understand, because I know as a young constable, in the first 6 months going to these calls for service, I thought, why doesn't she just leave, right? And I've heard that with other people and other professions. It is not that simple, okay? It's complex. So some of the barriers and challenges, risk factors is, self-esteem, isolation, there's cultural barriers, professions. So we've had CEOs, judges, police officers, all be victims of intimate partner violence. They're making decisions for others in their community every day, and they don't want anyone to know that they're living in these situations, right? So the self-esteem and the isolation come in fairly quickly in an abusive relationship. Self-esteem is extremely important to sort of make you, your confidence allows you to be successful at things. If you don't have a good self-esteem, it affects your decision-making and you second-guess yourself. And this can be a real barrier for these women to get out of these relationships, right? Pets. Pets are a barrier challenge because women will not leave their pets behind. Animals are such a huge support for the victims of abuse, but if we do not ensure their safety, the entire family, including the pet, will be at risk for abuse or death. Okay, and Andrew talked about this yesterday. If you don't take care of the entire family, then everybody's going to suffer in that family, including the animal. There's lasting effects of intimate partner violence. There could be mental health issues, physical health issues, broken bones. They have broken bones and other physical things that happen to them throughout the relationship. Suicidal thoughts, you heard Andrew talk about that yesterday. He said he wouldn't be here if it wasn't for his dog when he was younger. There's alcohol and drug abuse. So a lot of these victims self-medicate to be able to stay in these relationships. Chronic disease, we all know the role that stress plays in heart and stroke and cancers. Effects on children is particularly when it comes to a pet. So some of the research of the children exposed to intimate partner violence, 66% have also been exposed to pet abuse. 51% said they protected one of their pets from being hurt. Children witnessing animal cruelty experiencing significantly more risk of adolescence or adult interpersonal violence, and they experience more mental health issues. The flip side of that, and we heard Andrew talk about this yesterday, is that there's research out there that states children who commit acts of animal cruelty are usually living in a house where there is cruelty to animals. Children mimic what they see, right? They're little sponges. It is often first spotted when children are 4 to 6, but it's underreported because who's going to report children? Most of the time, it's going to be parents, so it's underreported. Children who develop antisocial behaviors, and remember from one of the earlier slides, animal abuse is an antisocial behavior, tend to be exposed to what's known in the industry as risky families. And risky families could include abuse of a child, over family conflict, low nurturance and warmth in the home, and just living in a negative environment. Children in these risky families should be referred to Child and Family Services, as they can become abusive themselves or have long-term mental health issues, right? Back to the research that's on the screen. Cross-reporting is necessary so children do not fall through the cracks. If you suspect a child is living in a risky family or is engaged in animal abuse, report that to Child and Family Services in your area and police. Animal welfare investigators also need to report to police and child protection, okay? Animal welfare investigators are in homes every day, and people will do and say things in front of animal welfare investigators that they would never do or say in front of a police officer. So you can become aware of these things, so you need to report that, okay? Otherwise, these children fall through the cracks, and they can become abusers themselves. There's a term in policing called proactive policing, but you can apply that to any field working with victims of violent crime, okay? Proactive just refers to a preventive anticipatory approach rather than strictly a reactive response to intimate partner violence. It presents an opportunity to prevent future harm and victimization by taking initiatives to improving intervention, okay? So how do we do this? Well, you have to know the bigger picture. To know the bigger picture, you have to know the facts and the research, and you have to keep that in mind, okay? So we're going to talk about 3 pieces of research I think is invaluable for you to know as when it comes to partner abuse. So 89 to 93% of intimate partner violence cases involve the use of an animal. 56% of women stay or will not report abusive situations to protect their pets. Some survivors return because they fear for the animal's safety. Pets, therefore, can be a barrier to getting both the animal and the victim out of the violent situation. There's been research which has found that some women will protect their pets as much as they would protect their children. They're not leaving them behind. If you want the human victim and the pets to be safe, you have to ensure the pet safety. Okay? Recognize the significance of an animal in a victim's life. Second piece of research, a woman whose partner had threatened pets was 5 times more likely to experience domestic physical violence in a relationship. Pets are used to coerce, humiliate, and control their victims. Over 71% of female victims of intimate partner violence who own pets reported that their batters had harmed, killed, or threatened pets to coerce, control, and humiliate them. The reasons animals are used is because the animal is a tool for the abuser to get what they want. Okay, it's just like for any officers that are hearing this, it's just like a guy that breaks into houses or businesses, they carry around break and enter tools. Here, the tool happens to be the animal. That's the tool for the abuser to get what they want. And they're often not just idle threats either. Most often, the pet is severely injured or killed. In Canada, we have threats to an animal. That's a criminal code offense, and we urge police to charge threats to that animal, right? Our Crown prosecutors will hold the accused in custody to get a condition not to possess pets. That serves a few purposes. It takes the abuser out of the house, away from the human victim and pet, because even if the female victim isn't willing to go through with charges, they have a duty not to possess pets, so they can't be in that house anymore, right? Second, once the criminal charge is laid, we can take fingerprints and photographs, which puts the abuser in the criminal database, so that if he moves to another jurisdiction where another police force is, they'll still know that this person has abused pets or has threatened pets. It also gives the victim some time to think, and victim services or counselors to work with that victim. That's very important, and we're going to talk about that. If you are police, ask local victim welfare if they have had other calls involving that suspect. In Canada and other countries, animal welfare investigators lay charges under different legislation than what police do, and animal welfare investigators and police do not share the same computers. So police would never know the accused was investigated or charged by somebody other than police. Having information that the abuser was investigated and charged by animal welfare is valuable information for Crown prosecutors and may allow for the courts to give increased penalties if convicted. Cross-reporting is so necessary. It allows police, animal welfare, Crown prosecutors to have all the information and that they're not working with pieces of information, right? And that also allows, so then we start to see the abuser get increased penalties and children, get help. It's just so important, these cross-reporting. If you hear statements like he just threatened to hit the dog, recognize it as an intimidation control tactic and ask the victim, did the abuser say that to get the victim to comply with the demand? If you are police and the jurisdiction where you work does not have a threats to an animal piece of legislation, know what other criminal charges could apply. For example, you may have an intimidation charge in your area that you could lay, or in Scotland, for example, they have the coercive control legislation. If your victim services or a counselor try to convince the victim to report to police by educating them on the fact that when animals are threatened or abused, the human is 5 times more likely to be physically abused. Also impress upon the victim that when threats are made to an animal to abuse or kill it, the animal often ends up abused or dead. Be honest with the victim so they can make an informed decision. Remember, these pets mean everything to these victims. So if they think their pet's going to be harmed, most of the time they'll make that decision to leave sooner than if they didn't know that. Okay. So how do you ascertain whether the 3 above situations have occurred? Ask questions. Be investigators. You don't have to be a police officer to be an investigator. And many professions are investigators without even knowing that they are. So for an example, veterinarians, you're investigators just by the very fact that you never have a patient that can tell you what's happened to them. You have to, ask questions and do diagnostics, and you're investigators, right? Victim services and counselors, you're also investigators. Victims may be traumatized or not want to talk about what's done to them. So victim services and counselors have to ask a lot of questions before they get the full story of what's happened. Violence link questions are specific to weed out animal or human abuse. These questions relate right back to the 3 research points we just talked about. They should be on every victim intake form at victim services. Veterinarian offices should use them, animal welfare interviews, and any other profession that deals with victims of violent crime. They will reveal or flush out both animal and human abuse if there is any. And affirmative responses should prompt you to ask further investigative questions. And if you are a veterinarian, they will help you corroborate your diagnosis when it comes to court. The answers to these questions also help the courts if you are police or animal welfare investigators. Make sure you include these questions and the answers in your court briefs because they can show mindset and or intent of the abuser. Okay? So first question, and you'll see how they relate right back to the 1, 2, 3 points of research. Has anyone in the home ever threatened or harmed animals in any way? Have animals ever been used to coerce, humiliate, intimidate another person in the home to get what they want? And has a child in the home ever witnessed pet abuse? So the first 2, if an animal's been threatened, the human's going to be 5 times more likely to have physical confrontation. You also know if they've been threatened or they've been used to coerce, intimidate, and control another person, 9 times out of 10, the animal is abused or killed. Okay? And for the child, well, if you ask this question, if they've ever witnessed pet abuse, there you go. You have pet abuse if they say yes, right? The other thing is, if they've witnessed pet abuse, you need to report that to Child and Family Services to get them the assistance so they don't become abusers themselves or have long-term mental health issues or aggression issues, right? So you need that information. So intervention office, how do you intervene? How do you help to stop this violence from continuing? It's all about providing the victim resources to help them and the pet get out of these violent situations, right? That any information you give them has to be written down because people living in stressful situations won't remember an oral phone number or an oral address that you give them, okay? So first of all, you need to know the victim may be given a bed on or sofa at a friend's or family place, but they might not be allowed to take the pet with them. There's many reasons for this. Some, family and friends might have allergies. There's somebody in the home that might fear for animals, and there's cultural reasons. Some cultures don't allow animals in their home. So you have to know the women's shelters in your area that will take both the human victim and the pet. Now, these are few and far between, and even if you have them in your area, beds are often full, right? So the other thing you need to give the victim is a place where they can take their pets to be housed without the owner having to give up ownership of the pets. Also, be aware in the rural areas, farm animals are often pets. We've had Donnie the donkey, Porky the pig, George the horse, and a whole array of farm animals be pets. And Note that these farm animals are just as important to them, and the bond is just as strong as that of, your dog or your cat that you have at home. Okay, no difference to these victims. Okay. So we had research come out of Canada last year about farm animals and their role in domestic violence situations. And besides having the bond with the farm animals, they found that very often it's the victim of violence who's doing the majority of the animal care. So they're afraid that if they leave the farm, those animals will not be cared for and could be neglected or harmed. Okay, so those farm animals need to be taken care of as well. Organizations who take pets for safekeeping, they should be 24/7 because crime doesn't just happen between 9 and 5, right? So you need to be able to get a hold of them after hours. They need to have the means to deal with unhealthy or injured pets. And they need to take any species. So if there's a goat that needs to be housed, there should be a farm that they can take that goat to, okay? The third point is find out where your victim services are in your area or counselors who are trained to deal with victims of violent crime and keep that information so that you can give that to a victim or a client that you're dealing with. In Canada, we have victim crisis units that are usually either attached to the municipality or the police service. They are staffed with usually registered psychologists who are trained to deal with victims of violent crime. Remember, it can take multiple times for a victim to leave and come back into an abusive situation before they leave for good. So these victim services will support the victims while they are in these abusive situations. And they are often able to get the victim to make the decision to leave sooner. They will help the victim to deal with all of those barriers, challenges, and risk factors that we talked about, the isolation and financial and all of that stuff. They'll put them in touch with financial services, housing, legal counseling, and other supports that they need to be successful. Once the victim makes the decision to leave the abusive relationship, they will do what's called a safety plan. They'll pick a date and time when it's best for the victim to leave. Most of the time, it'll be in the future, okay, like a month down the line. And that's because the most dangerous time for the victim of an intimate partner violence is when the victim is leaving the relationship. They and their pet is at a heightened risk for severe injury or death. So by the time the victim's ready to move, everything will be in place for the victim to set them up for success and not return to those abusive situations, right? Victim services often know where a victim can house their pet and are a wealth of information. So they'll know where the first 2 points that I talked about are most of the time. If you suspect a person is a victim of intimate partner violence, but they're saying they have not been abused and they don't want to report to police, leave the victim with the information anyways. You don't have to call them a liar or inadvertently insult them. You say something like, I understand nothing happened today, but I want to leave you with some information in case you or a friend would like to access resources in the future. Okay. If victims have the information and they are civilian resources, not police, they will often call civilian resources before they'll ever call police. Most victims do not want to be involved with police and the justice system. So unless they're being physically assaulted, most of the time they won't call police. On my page under the resource tab near the bottom is a link for the UK resources as well as the United States. And of course, there's a ton of Canadian resources there. You hit the link and it'll come up in your browser. If you're a police or animal welfare, you should carry these resources with you at all times and provide them in writing to victims. At the very least, have a phone number for victim services to give to the victim. Many victim services have pamphlets that you can go and pick up or they'll deliver to you, and you can give those out or have those on you at all times. Or if you're a veterinarian service, have them in your waiting room. So sexual offenses and animal abuse. New South Wales police study, they examined a random sample of 947 offenders convicted of animal cruelty, homicide, and sexual homicides. Animal abuse is a better predictor of sexual assault than previous convictions for homicide, arsons, or weapons offenses. Animal cruelty offenders predominantly have criminal records related to sexual assault, domestic violence, and firearms offenses. Okay. Human trafficking, and I'm referring to the sex trade in human trafficking, it often presents itself to police as domestic violence. Police can miss human trafficking as it does present itself to domestic violence and other professions as well. So if you're a veterinarian and a victim brings the animal in, and it could present itself as, a boyfriend situation or a partner situation. What would alert you that there's more going on than what's apparent, and that it's not only a domestic situation, but there's human trafficking involved? Okay. Animal welfare investigators, please look for signs when you go to animal abuse calls. You are in these homes, and you'll be able to pick up these signs and things that are going on. Young girls have animals, often bought by the abuser. They wait for the victim to form bonds with the animal, which doesn't take long, and then they use threats of abuse or to kill the animal to get the victim to comply to work in the sex trade. Other methods include luring victims with animals. We had a guy working out of Toronto, Montreal, the abuser. What he did is he advertised puppies online for sale. And when regular women in the community, not involved in the criminal element at all, went to buy these puppies from him, he kidnapped them, raped them, and then forced them into the sex trade. Okay, that case, I have a video on my video link on my website, and also the case is under Cases tab if you want to read more about that. But there's all sorts of ways that these abusers get women into the sex trafficking ring. So what's some of the red flags? You have a teenage girl with a male that is 20-something or older, or a 20-year-old with a 4-year-old. Large age differences are a huge red flag, okay? The other thing is a teenager or a young girl has expensive clothing, jewelry, or other possessions and she doesn't live at home and doesn't have the means to have those things. If you're talking to them, they seem to adhere to a scripted or rehearsed response in social interactions. Remember in one of the first slides I talked about look at how humans interact? When you first suspect you're dealing with a victim of violent crime, give them victim services information. And if they have a pet, where they can take their pet for safety. Even if they deny they are being abused, some say something like I was talking about before. You want to give them information for future reference, or as a community, so as a veterinarian, you can say, as a community service, our vet clinic wants everyone to know about victim services in the area, and then give them a pamphlet or write down the name of victim services, a phone number, and where they can be located. So there's easy ways to give them information, even if you just have a suspicion of domestic violence, or there's human trafficking or some violent crime going on. So in 2019, I testified at the Canadian Parliament Justice Committee to have bestiality and animal fighting legislation amended. Prior to 2019, you had to prove penetration to lay a charge of bestiality. Legislation now includes touching an animal for any sexual purpose. We no longer have to prove penetration to lay that charge. We also wanted 2 amendments on that. One was to put anybody convicted of bestiality on the sex offender registry. Bestiality before 2019 was considered an animal abuse case, so it wasn't considered a sexual assault case, as incredible as that is. We also wanted a provision for the courts to be able to ban ownership of animals, because again, the animal is a tool for the abuser to get what they want, right? Part of the testimony that I talked about that day was a study of 44,202 adult males evaluated for sexual misconduct, found that bestiality is the single largest risk factor and strongest predictor of increased risk for committing child sexual abuse. And Andrew Campbell alluded to this yesterday as well in some of his statistics. I also talked about researchers also found that approximately 50% of rapists and over 25% of pedophiles had childhood histories of harming animals. That same study confirmed childhood sexual assault abusers use animals to lure and or groom their victims. We always knew pedophiles use animals to get the victims to come to them, but in the last, I'd say 7 to 10 years, we've seen a huge increase in them using animals to groom the victims to sexual touch, okay? One study in Canada found that 82% of bestiality cases involved the sexual abuse of a child. It's very, very prevalent, and people don't realize how prevalent it is. Pedophiles try to get the child normalized the inappropriate feeling of touch on their private parts, so that it is not foreign for the child to have their private parts touched for reasons other than medical or cleaning. It's a desensitized process used to normalize sexual touch to children. And so the conversation between a pedophile and a child in this scenario would go something like, look, I touched the doggy there. It didn't hurt the doggy. You can touch the doggy there. So they first get the child normalized to touching sexual parts on a dog or a cat or some kind of animal. Then it morphs itself into, you can touch me where you touch the doggy, or can I touch you where I touch the doggy, right? So it's that whole gradual progression of sexual touch to animals and to people. The number one item found on a pedophile's computer, besides child porn, is animal pornography. If you're in a home and you see animal pornography, you should report that to a child abuse detective. This is on a 9-point checklist that Mark Rindle and I published. So frontline investigators would have a starting point when investigating animal abuse or violence-linked cases, right? But once you find that, you need to go to somebody that's trained in how to investigate child abuse cases or animal abuse cases. Police also investigate cases where one partner forces another into posing and or committing sexual acts with an animal and then takes pictures or videotapes it. Then the abuser will say, if you leave me or you report me, I will put this up on the internet. And remember, these domestic violence crimes or partner abuse crimes don't just happen with marginalized societies. If you're a CEO of a company or some other professional, you're out there making decisions. You don't want this up on the internet, right? So, and the prevalence, again, with the partner abuse and the bestiality cases, in a test group of women who had past relationships with battering and non-battering partners, 41% of the battering partners forced them to sexually interact with animals, compared to 5% of the non-battering partners. It is prevalent. It is very prevalent, and people don't realize how prevalent it is. Victims tend not to divulge this, even when they are proceeding with an assault charge. It is demoralizing, and they're ashamed that they may have complied with the demand. And that's exactly why the abusers do this. However, in some cases where detectives have asked the victims, they did divulge what happened in these situations. So we're recommending that detectives and victim services or counselors need to ask the victim if the abuser has asked or forced the victim to do anything outside the norm with an animal. This somewhat normalizes the questions. For a veterinarian, if you suspect the animal has been sexually abused, you can ask if your client knows if anyone who would be sexually interacting with the animal. Be forthright with the client, because there have been times when the partner has been sexually abusing the animal and the human victim did not know about it until a video surfaced. Okay, we had that case in Ottawa. Every time the guy would masturbate, he would beat a female dog's genitals, but he'd also tape it. And one day that showed up on a victim's computer. The main thing is to not shy away from these conversations. It's not pleasant to be talking to somebody about bestiality and asking if somebody's interacted sexually with their animal. I understand that. It's sort of like if you're in human resources, talking to an employee about their body odor. It's not pleasant, but we can't shy away from it, and we have to ask that question, or we'll never know if the animal's been sexually abused, because that's not something police or even animal services can go to and find. Often, it takes a veterinarian, taking that animal to a veterinarian to figure that out, right? Because they're internal injuries most of the time. So we're going to move on to other steps you can take to make your community safer for all living beings. Make the right call. If it's intentional animal abuse, report to police, not animal welfare inspectors. Animal welfare inspectors are not trained to investigate human abuse calls. If it's neglect or hoarding or something like that, then absolutely make the call to animal welfare. But intentional animal abuse needs to be reported to police. In Canada, in fact, now a lot of the criminal code animal abuse cases are automatically downloaded to police to investigate. So a lot of the animal welfare organizations won't even take them. Cross-reporting. Victim services fall through the cracks and abusers do not get appropriate penalties in court when police and courts do not have all the information, right? We have to stop working in our silos. You know, one household, a veterinarian can have some information, animal welfare can have some information on it, police might have a little bit of information on it, but nobody has the big picture on it. And when that happens, you know, abusers don't get what they deserve in court. Children don't get the proper help that they need to get out of those risky families. And, you know, victims, the female victims or in some case male victims that are being abused, they don't get assistance either. So we have to stop working in our silos. Sometimes to make that happen, you need memorandum of agreements to overcome FOI issues or guidelines in place. And I would recommend doing them before you're faced with that situation. It's important for professionals such as veterinarians and victim services to have protocols in place for reporting the abuse to other agencies. Failure to report will allow for the violence to continue in the home and will continue to expose all members of the family to violence, and pets will continue to be abused and killed. Cross-training. Each sector, like today, normally if you're in a training environment, you're doing case studies and discussions and all that sort of stuff. And so you learn how each sector operates. And they're very valuable training scenarios. The United States National District Attorneys Association reported findings of study when it comes to cross-reporting of animal abuse. When humans and animal protection agencies collaborating with educators, prosecutors, law enforcement can come together to co-train regarding the legal requirements and practicalities of their work, this helps all agencies to work together cohesively for early intervention in violent homes. Violent link coalitions are great for sharing information, knowledge, problem solving. A lot of regional coalitions are popping up in Canada, and that's fantastic in Canada or the United States because this country is so vast. We have different needs on the East Coast than we do on the West Coast. And I'll just give you an example of that. In British Columbia and Alberta and the West Coast, there's a lot of cockfighting where it comes to animal fighting. You get into central Canada or the East Coast, and it's dog fighting primarily. So you might have different needs and different ways to approach that issue, right? A link coalition typically involves collaboration among victim services, animal welfare agencies, law enforcement, crown attorneys, educational professionals, and public health professionals. When a link coalition is formed, the foundation will be in place for cross-training, cross-reporting, and breaking down the silos to allow more efficient sharing of information about families in need and pets in danger. And these link coalitions, they do actual memorandum of agreements in order to share information that complies with freedom of information legislation. And I've been working with some organizations across Canada to help do that. And the FBI usually puts out a monthly newsletter. It's called the LED. They talked about cross-reporting in their August 2021 issue. A multidisciplinary cross-reporting approach to animal cruelty as well as to other crimes involved with animal cruelty creates an opportunity to save lives. Violence-linked training will save lives, both animals and humans. And the FBI and the International Association of Chiefs of Police have recognized that. So you heard me say at the very beginning that violence link and violence link training, and animal welfare training is very much supported by the Chiefs of Police organization. So here's one, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, in their February 2018 magazine called The Police Chief, they state this. Police officers and detectives should be appropriately trained in the recognition and documentation of crimes against animals, and they should have sufficient resources to enforce animal cruelty laws. They go on to say, animal abuse investigations are vital because animal maltreatment is a co-occurring and central aspect of interpersonal violence. Animal care professionals such as veterinarians, animal control officers, and humane law enforcement all have roles to play in prevention, identification, and treatment of interpersonal violence. The co-occurrence of child abuse and domestic violence with animal abuse and the significance of childhood animal abuse means that animal welfare overlaps with both family welfare and community safety. Violence-linked training saves lives. I can't say it enough. anyone working with victims of violent crime, animals or humans, you should invest in violence link training, okay? For anyone who's not trained on animal abuse or violence link, please do not forget to refer to the 9-point checklist that Mark Rendell and I put together. This is a starting point, right? The investigator still needs to be trained on investigating violence link cases and or animal abuse. It's on my website. I believe it's on the Nature Watch website as well. The checklist, again, will give you a starting point until you can receive violence link training or animal abuse. With that, I will close. Any questions, please email me. If you're in North America and you wish violence link training, I have training tailored to various professions and various time allotments. I also work with governments and organizations to help them form violence link coalitions. Mark, of course, is your European contact for training. Before I go, I'd just like to mention to all veterinarians in the audience that I'm presenting at the 7th International Veterinarian Social Work Summit in October. The links to register is on my website under the conference tab. And I thank you again for your time and attention. Please take care of yourself. And to all those people working in Ukraine to save animals,